The wind was brutal that afternoon, tearing through the streets and sending scarves, hats, and forgotten receipts tumbling through the air like lost memories. Simon wasn't paying much attention to any of it until a flash of deep red caught his eye. A scarf, lightweight and delicate, fluttered past him, twisting in the wind like it had a mind of its own. Without thinking, he reached for it, fingers just barely grazing the soft fabric before it slipped away again. His eyes followed the scarf's path down the street, and that's when he saw her. She was moving quickly, her long dark hair whipping around her face as she tried to chase after the runaway scarf. But the wind was relentless, pushing it further and further away. Simon didn't hesitate. He took off after it, weaving through confused pedestrians, dodging a cyclist, and nearly crashing into a street vendor's cart. The scarf danced just out of reach, taunting him until finally it snagged on a lamppost. He lunged forward, grabbing it before the wind could steal it again. Breathless, he turned to find her standing a few feet away, her green eyes wide with surprise. "You," she started, stepping closer. Simon held up the scarf. "I think this belongs to you." She exhaled a shaky laugh, pressing a hand to her chest. "I can't believe you actually caught it." "It put up a fight," Simon said, offering it to her. Their fingers brushed as she took it, and for some reason, that small touch sent a strange warmth through him. She took a step back, wrapping the scarf around her neck. "Thank you. I don't know what I would have done if I lost it." "Sent out a missing persons report?" he joked. She laughed, and the sound was warm, like something familiar even though they had never met before. "Probably. Or just stood there, mourning my loss." Simon found himself smiling. "Glad I could save you from that." She hesitated, then extended her hand. "I'm Delilah." "Simon." He shook her hand, trying to ignore the way his pulse jumped at the feel of her skin against his. "Nice to meet you, Delilah." "Nice to meet you too." She glanced down the street, then back at him. "I should probably get going. But seriously, thank you." Before he could think of a reason to keep her there, she gave him one last grateful smile and turned away. He watched her walk off, feeling an odd sense of disappointment settle in his chest. It was ridiculous he didn't even know her. But something about that brief encounter, the sound of her laugh, the warmth of her touch, it stuck with him. And he had a sinking feeling it wasn't going to leave anytime soon. Simon didn't expect to see her again. New York was massive, a city full of fleeting moments and misconnections. He told himself that running into Delilah had just been one of those moments, a random, insignificant encounter that didn't mean anything. But then, a week later, he saw her. He was sitting in a small cafe, sipping his coffee, when she walked in. She was wearing the same red scarf. His heart kicked up. Before he could overthink it, he stood. "Delilah?" She turned, eyes widening in surprise. "Simon." He grinned. "Didn't think I'd ever see you again." "Me neither," she admitted. "Guess fate had other plans." "Fate." He liked the sound of that. "Are you?" He hesitated, then forced the words out before he lost his nerve. "Would you want to sit with me?" She hesitated, glancing at the counter like she was debating whether to grab her coffee and leave. But then she smiled. "Yeah, I'd like that." Simon let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. She sat across from him, pulling the scarf off and setting it on the table between them. Felt like a full-circle moment. "So," she said, wrapping her hands around her coffee cup, "tell me something about yourself." He chuckled. "That's pretty broad." She shrugged. "You chased after a scarf for me. I think that earns you the right to give me one interesting fact." He thought for a moment. "All right, I hate peanut butter." Her eyes widened. "That is a crime." "It's a personal preference," he defended. "A wrong one." She shook her head, mock disappointment written all over her face. He laughed. "Okay, your turn. What's something about you?" She considered for a moment. "I've always wanted to learn how to surf." "Really?" "Yeah. Not exactly a common hobby in New York, though." "No, but there are places," he pointed out. "You should do it." "Maybe." She smiled. "If I ever get the courage." "I have a feeling you're braver than you think." Her expression shifted slightly, something unreadable flashing in her eyes. But before he could figure out what it was, she looked away, taking a sip of her coffee. They spent the next hour talking. About work, about life, about ridiculous things like their worst first dates and childhood dreams. And the more Simon talked to her, the more he realized he didn't want this to be the last time. When they finally left the cafe, the air had turned colder and the sky had darkened into a soft dusk. Simon walked her to the subway entrance, fighting the urge to ask if he could see her again. But before he could say anything, Delilah turned to him. "This was really nice." He nodded. "Yeah, it was." She hesitated, then smiled. "I wouldn't mind doing it again." His chest tightened. "Really? Really?" She glanced down, then back up at him. "Maybe I'll let you convince me to try surfing someday." "I'll hold you to that," he said, grinning. She laughed softly, then stepped backward toward the subway stairs. "Good night, Simon." "Good night, Delilah." He watched her disappear down the stairs, the red scarf trailing behind her. And for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was chasing after something that actually mattered. Simon had never been the type to believe in fate. Life was a collection of choices, a series of events strung together by decisions, not destiny. But somehow, meeting Delilah felt different. It wasn't something he had planned, yet here he was, standing outside the same cafe a week later, waiting for her. The street was alive with the usual evening rush, people moving in every direction, conversations blending into the hum of the city. Simon shifted on his feet, hands tucked into his jacket pockets. The anticipation sat heavy in his chest, a strange mix of excitement and nerves. It had been years since he'd felt this way about someone, since he'd wanted to see a person not out of obligation, but because he couldn't stop thinking about them. And then she appeared. Delilah walked toward him with an easy grace, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, a soft burgundy sweater draped over her frame. The scarf, the one that had started it all, was nowhere in sight tonight, but she didn't need it to be recognizable. There was something about the way she carried herself, a quiet confidence mixed with an underlying uncertainty, as if she wasn't sure how much of herself she wanted to reveal to the world. "You made it," Simon said as she approached. "Of course I did," she replied, tilting her head slightly. "Did you think I'd stand you up?" "No," he admitted. "But I also didn't expect to run into you again after that first time." She exhaled a short laugh. "Guess we're bad at saying goodbye. Or really good at finding reasons not to." Her gaze flickered to his, something unspoken passing between them. Then, she motioned toward the cafe door. "Shall we?" They stepped inside, the scent of fresh coffee and warm pastries wrapping around them. The place was dimly lit, cozy in a way that made it easy to lose track of time. They found a table near the window, and as they settled in, Simon noticed the way Delilah's fingers traced the edge of her cup absent-mindedly, as if lost in thought. "You okay?" he asked. She glanced up, as if startled by the question, then smiled. "Yeah, just long day. Work." She nodded but didn't elaborate. Instead, she changed the subject. "What about you? How was your day?" He could tell she was deflecting, but he let it slide. "Not bad. Uneventful, mostly." She arched an eyebrow. "Uneventful is good sometimes. Depends on the company you keep." A playful glint appeared in her eyes. "Are you saying I make things eventful?" "I'm saying I haven't stopped thinking about you since the last time we saw each other." The words left his mouth before he could second-guess them. He expected her to deflect again, to brush it off with a joke, but instead, she held his gaze, her expression softening. "I haven't stopped thinking about you either." Something shifted between them in that moment, an unspoken acknowledgement of whatever this was, whatever it could be. It wasn't just casual conversation over coffee anymore. It was something else, something that neither of them quite knew how to define. Delilah leaned back slightly, her fingers still resting against the cup. "Tell me something about you that you haven't told anyone else." Simon considered the request, tapping his fingers against the table. "That's a bold ask. You don't strike me as someone who scares easily," she teased. He chuckled. "I don't, but fine. Something I haven't told anyone." He paused, then sighed. "I used to want to be a musician." Her lips parted slightly. "Really?" "Yeah, I played guitar growing up. Wrote songs, even." "What happened?" He shrugged. "Life happened. Bills, responsibilities. Music became a thing I used to do instead of something I pursued." Her expression turned thoughtful. "Do you miss it?" "Every day." She studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "You should pick it up again." "It's not that simple." "Why not?" "Because once you put something down for long enough, it's hard to remember why you ever believed you could do it in the first place." She didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached across the table, her fingers brushing against the back of his hand, just a fleeting touch, but enough to send a jolt through him. Maybe the reason doesn't matter as much as the fact that you still want it. Simon swallowed. She had a way of cutting through the noise, of seeing things for what they were instead of what they seemed to be. I'll think about it, he murmured. Good. She pulled her hand back, a small smile playing at her lips. Now it's your turn. Ask me something. He didn't even have to think about it. What are you afraid of? She blinked, clearly not expecting that question. That's a loaded one. You asked me to be honest. A beat passed before she answered. I'm afraid of getting attached to something I can't keep. Her words hit him harder than he expected. He didn't ask for clarification because he already understood. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their conversation settling between them. Then Delilah let out a breath and smiled as if shaking off the heaviness. Come on, she said, standing. Let's walk. Simon followed her out onto the street, the cool air wrapping around them. They walked side by side, their steps in sync, the city stretching out before them. Neither of them spoke for a while, but the silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was filled with possibility, with the quiet understanding that some things didn't need to be said aloud. Eventually, Delilah broke the silence. You ever have one of those nights where you don't want it to end? Simon glanced at her, his chest tightening. Yeah. She looked up at him, something unreadable in her expression. Me too. And with that, he knew he wasn't just chasing after a woman who had dropped her scarf. He was chasing after something much bigger. The autumn air had turned crisp, the city streets painted in hues of amber and rust. Simon walked beside Delilah, their steps slow, unhurried, as if neither of them was willing to let the night end too soon. The streets had begun to quiet, the rush of the evening commute giving way to the hum of distant traffic and the occasional burst of laughter from a nearby cafe. The world felt smaller with her beside him, the space between them charged with something unspoken. She tilted her head slightly, her gaze sweeping over the storefronts they passed, the glow of neon signs casting a soft light on her face. Simon studied her in the fleeting moments between streetlights, the sharp, thoughtful lines of her expression shifting as they walked. He had spent years navigating the city, but somehow with Delilah everything looked different. They reached a small park, one of those hidden pockets of green wedged between towering buildings. Delilah hesitated for only a moment before stepping onto the path, the crunch of fallen leaves beneath her boots filling the silence. Simon followed, watching as she ran her fingers along the back of an empty bench, her touch absent-minded. I used to come here all the time, she said, her voice softer now, as if speaking too loudly might disturb the quiet. When I needed to think. Or when I didn't want to go home just yet. Simon leaned against the nearest lamppost, his hands tucked into his jacket pockets. Why didn't you want to go home? She exhaled, her breath visible in the cool air. Sometimes home isn't the place where you feel the most at ease. He didn't push for more. The weight in her voice told him there was history there, something she wasn't ready to unfold completely. Instead, he gestured toward the swing set at the edge of the park. Come on. She raised an eyebrow but followed him anyway. He took the seat beside her, the metal chains creaking slightly as they swayed. Delilah laughed under her breath, shaking her head. I haven't sat on a swing in years. Feels like a good night to change that. She kicked off lightly, her movements cautious at first, then bolder, her hair lifting slightly with each motion. Simon watched her, the way her expression softened, the way the tension in her shoulders melted away. I used to think swinging felt like flying, she mused, her voice drifting between them. He pushed off slowly, matching his pace to hers. Maybe that's why kids love it so much. For a few seconds, nothing is pulling them down. She turned to him, her lips curving just slightly. Is this your attempt at being poetic? Maybe. He shrugged. Or maybe I just like the idea of letting go, even if it's just for a moment. She was quiet for a beat, then said, letting go is easier when you don't have anything to hold onto. Simon stopped swinging, his feet scraping against the ground. And what if you do? Delilah's movement slowed until she came to a stop as well. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked up at the sky, the city lights making it impossible to see the stars. Then you have to decide if holding on is worth the risk. Simon knew she wasn't just talking about swinging anymore. A breeze swept through the park, rustling the leaves around them. Delilah let out a breath and stood, brushing her hands against her sweater. We should probably start heading back. He wanted to tell her that there was no rush, that he would have stayed there all night if it meant getting to know her more. But instead, he just nodded, falling into step beside her once more as they made their way back to the main road. They walked in silence for a while, the sounds of the city filling the spaces between them. But it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind that existed between two people who didn't need to fill every moment with words. When they reached the subway entrance, Delilah hesitated at the top of the stairs. She turned to him, her expression unreadable. "Simon." He looked at her, waiting. "I don't know what this is," she admitted, her fingers tightening around the strap of her bag. "But I like being around you." His pulse jumped. "Good. Because I like being around you too." A small smile flickered across her lips, and for a moment it looked like she might say something else. But instead, she shifted her weight and took a step backward. "Good night, Simon." Before he could respond, she disappeared down the stairs, the sound of her footsteps fading into the depths of the station. Simon stood there for a long moment, staring after her, the weight of her words settling deep in his chest. "I don't know what this is." Neither did he. But he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't done chasing after her yet. Simon wasn't the type to wait around for something that wasn't guaranteed. He had spent years living by the rule that if someone wanted to be in his life, they would make an effort. And yet, with Delilah, he found himself breaking every unspoken boundary he had set for himself. It had been days since their night at the park, and though he hadn't heard from her, he couldn't shake the memory of how she had looked at him before she left, that hesitant, lingering glance, as if she wanted to say something but didn't know how. He told himself he wouldn't reach out first. He told himself if she wanted to see him, she would call. But then, on a crisp Saturday afternoon, he found himself walking through the same streets where they had first met, as if the city itself might give him a sign. And it did. He spotted her across the street, standing in front of an old bookstore, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing the edge of the display window. She looked lost in thought, her expression unreadable. Without thinking, he crossed the street, weaving through traffic, barely registering the honk of a passing cab. When he reached her, she turned, startled. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, she exhaled softly. "Simon." His chest tightened at the way she said his name, like she wasn't sure if she had been hoping to see him or hoping to avoid him. "I was just..." She trailed off, glancing at the bookstore window. He followed her gaze. "You like old books?" She nodded. "There's something comforting about them, the way they've been passed through different hands, each person leaving something behind in the pages." He studied her. "You're not just talking about books, are you?" Her lips parted slightly, as if caught off guard. Then, she let out a breath, shaking her head. "You always do that." "Do what?" "See through things I don't even realize I'm saying." Simon took a step closer, lowering his voice. "Maybe it's because I actually listen." Something flickered in her expression, something vulnerable, like she wasn't used to being heard in the way he was hearing her now. After a beat, she looked back at the bookstore. "Come inside with me?" He didn't hesitate. "Yeah." They stepped into the shop, the smell of old paper and worn leather wrapping around them. The wooden floor creaked slightly beneath their steps, the shelves towering and packed with books that had been touched by time. Delilah ran her fingers along the spines, pausing every so often to pull one out and examine the pages. For a while, they didn't speak, just existing in the quiet together, the intimacy of the moment settling between them. Then she held up a book, tilting her head slightly. "Ever read this one?" Simon glanced at the title. It was a love story, the kind that had been adapted into films more times than he could count. He shook his head. "Not really my thing." She smirked. "So, what is your thing?" He thought for a moment. "Stories that don't always have easy endings. The ones that make you work for the meaning." Delilah's expression shifted, something contemplative in her gaze. "Maybe that's why you keep chasing after things that aren't simple." He didn't miss the way her fingers tightened slightly around the book in her hands. "Maybe," he admitted. "Or maybe I just think some things are worth the effort." She looked up at him then, and for a moment he thought she might say something real, something that would finally give him a glimpse into whatever it was she was holding back. But instead, she turned toward the counter, buying the book without another word. When they stepped back outside, the air was cooler, the sun beginning to dip behind the buildings. Delilah hugged the book to her chest. "You want to get coffee?" Simon studied her, the way she was offering something without really saying what it was. He nodded. "Yeah." They found a small cafe nearby, tucked between two brick buildings, the kind of place that felt like it belonged to the city rather than just existing in it. They sat by the window, the steam from their cups curling between them. Delilah traced the edge of her coffee mug, her nails tapping lightly against the ceramic. "Can I ask you something?" "Anything." She hesitated, then met his gaze. Why do you keep showing up? Simon leaned back slightly, considering his answer carefully. Because I want to. Her brows furrowed slightly. It's that simple? It can be. She let out a soft laugh, shaking her head. You don't even know me. He tilted his head. I don't think that's true. She opened her mouth to argue, but something in his expression must have stopped her. Instead, she sighed, looking down at her coffee. Simon. He leaned forward. Tell me what you're afraid of. Her fingers tightened around the mug. I told you before. No, he said gently. You told me what you fear in general. But what is it about me that scares you? Her breath hitched slightly, and for a long moment she didn't answer. Then she whispered that you might actually mean it. Simon's chest ached at the quiet confession. He reached across the table, his fingers brushing against hers. I do. Delilah swallowed hard, looking at their hands at the point of contact that neither of them pulled away from. Then she exhaled, closing her eyes briefly before opening them again. I don't know how to do this. Simon squeezed her fingers gently. Neither do I. But maybe we don't need to have all the answers right now. She looked at him for a long time, something uncertain but hopeful in her eyes. Then she nodded. Okay. And just like that, something shifted. It wasn't a grand declaration, wasn't a promise sealed with certainty. But it was something. And for now, that was enough. Simon wasn't sure when it had happened, when the quiet moments with Delilah had begun to feel like something he couldn't go without. It hadn't been sudden, hadn't been a single grand realization, but rather a slow, steady pull, like the tide creeping up the shore, inch by inch, until one day you realized you were in too deep to walk away. And he didn't want to walk away. They started spending more time together, sometimes meeting for coffee, sometimes wandering through the city without a destination. The hesitation she once carried between them had softened, though it wasn't gone entirely. There were still moments when she would grow quiet, when she would look at him with something unreadable in her eyes, as if she was waiting for the moment when he would prove her fears right. But he never did. And he never would. One evening they found themselves on a rooftop overlooking the skyline, the city stretching out before them in a sea of twinkling lights. The air was brisk, the kind of cold that made you tuck your hands into your pockets, but neither of them seemed eager to leave. Delilah leaned against the railing, her breath visible in the night air. You ever think about how many people are out there, living their lives, making choices that change everything without realizing it? Simon stood beside her, letting the wind push against him. Yeah. All the time. She turned to him, her expression thoughtful. If you hadn't caught that scarf, do you think we'd still be here? He didn't hesitate. I'd like to think so. A small laugh escaped her, though there was no amusement in it. You make it sound like it was inevitable. Maybe it was. She shook her head, looking back at the city. I don't know if I believe in that. Simon studied her, the way her fingers gripped the railing as if grounding herself. You don't have to believe in fate to admit that some things feel too right to be coincidence. She exhaled softly but didn't argue. Instead, she turned slightly, studying him in the dim light. You never ask about my past. He held her gaze. Because I don't need to. I care about who you are now. Her throat bobbed as she swallowed, and for a moment she looked as if she might say something more. But then she just nodded. They stood in silence for a long time, the city breathing around them. And then, as if testing the weight of the moment, Delilah reached out, her fingers brushing against his. It was the smallest touch, barely more than a whisper of contact, but Simon felt it everywhere. He didn't move, didn't rush her. He just let her come to him in her own time. And eventually she did. She slid her hand into his, lacing their fingers together. It was the first time she had touched him like this, not by accident, not in passing, but because she wanted to. Simon tightened his grip just enough to let her know he was there. That he wasn't going anywhere. And for the first time since he had met her, she didn't pull away. Days passed, then weeks. Their lives wove together in ways Simon hadn't expected. He learned the way she took her coffee, the way she tucked her hair behind her ear when she was deep in thought. She learned that he had a habit of tapping his fingers against his knee when he was restless, that he always carried a book with him even if he didn't have time to read it. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments when Delilah would retreat into herself, when she would disappear inside her own thoughts and leave him wondering if she was about to slip away completely. But each time she came back. And that was enough. One evening they sat in his apartment, a record playing softly in the background, the scent of tea filling the air. Delilah sat cross-legged on the couch, flipping through the book she had bought the day they had run into each other at the bookstore. Simon watched her, the way her eyes traced the words, the way she absently twirled a loose thread on her sweater. Eventually, she looked up, catching him staring. What? She asked, amusement flickering in her expression. He shrugged. Just thinking. About. He hesitated, then said, how different my life would be if I hadn't chased after that scarf. Her fingers tightened slightly around the book, but she didn't look away. Simon. Her voice was quiet, careful. Why me? He frowned slightly. What do you mean? She set the book down, folding her hands in her lap. You could have walked away at any point, and I gave you reasons to plenty of them. But you didn't. Why? Simon leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. Because I saw you. She exhaled softly, something breaking in her expression. You don't even know everything about me. I don't need to, he said. I know enough. She swallowed hard, and for a moment, he thought she might finally let him in completely. But then, she stood abruptly, crossing the room and pressing her hands against the window pane. He didn't move, didn't push. He just waited. After a long silence, she spoke. I'm scared. Simon's chest tightened. Of what? She turned slightly, her gaze meeting his. Of what happens if I let myself believe you mean this? That you won't leave. He stood, closing the distance between them. I won't. Her breath hitched. You can't promise that. I can, he said softly. And I am. Her eyes searched his, looking for something, maybe a lie, maybe a flaw in his certainty. But there was none. And slowly, as if testing the weight of the moment, she reached for him. Simon pulled her into his arms, feeling the way she sank against him, the way her fingers curled into the fabric of his shirt. And for the first time, she didn't just let him hold her. She held him back. The first snowfall of the season dusted the city in quiet magic, coating rooftops and sidewalks in a layer of untouched white. Simon walked beside Delilah, their shoulders brushing every so often, their breath visible in the cold air. The city had slowed under the weight of winter, and for once it felt like there was no rush. She had been different these past few weeks. Something in her had softened, the walls she had so carefully built around herself no longer impenetrable. She still hesitated at times, still had moments where she seemed to retreat inward, but now, when she did, she let him pull her back. They reached a small bridge overlooking the frozen pond in the park. The street lamps glowed in the early evening light, casting a golden hue over the snow. Simon leaned against the railing, turning toward her. She wore a thick coat, her hands tucked into her pockets, but her cheeks were flushed pink from the cold. She looked at the ice below, the faint outlines of skaters gliding across it. I used to love skating when I was younger. Simon raised an eyebrow. Used to? She nodded. I haven't done it in years. Why not? She hesitated, then exhaled. I guess I just stopped making time for things that made me happy. Simon reached for her hand, pulling it from her pocket and lacing his fingers through hers. The warmth of her skin against his sent something steadying through him. Maybe it's time to change that. She looked at him then, something unreadable in her gaze. Simon. He waited, watching as she struggled with whatever she was about to say. Then she shook her head as if dismissing whatever thought had almost escaped her. Instead, she squeezed his hand lightly. Come on. Let's keep walking. He didn't push her. He had learned that Delilah would tell him things in her own time, and when she did, it would be because she was ready. They wandered through the park, the snow crunching beneath their steps, the city lights flickering between the bare tree branches. When they reached a small wooden bench, she sat first, tugging him down beside her. For a while, they just sat there, watching the world move around them. Then Delilah said something that made Simon's heart stop. I love you. For a second, he wasn't sure he had heard her right. She wasn't looking at him, her gaze was fixed on the snow-covered path ahead, her fingers gripping the edge of her coat. But her words hung between them, fragile and real. Simon turned toward her, his chest tight. Say that again. She finally met his eyes. I love you. He didn't hesitate. He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing against the cold skin of her cheeks. I love you, too. A shaky breath escaped her, and then she laughed soft and disbelieving, like she hadn't expected this moment to feel so easy. Simon kissed her, slow and deep, feeling the way she melted into him, the way her hands clung to his jacket like she never wanted to let go. And he knew without a doubt that he would never let her. When they finally pulled apart, she rested her forehead against his, their breath mingling in the cold air. I was scared, she admitted, that this wasn't real, that I'd lose you if I let myself believe in it. He brushed a strand of hair from her face. You're not going to lose me. She closed her eyes for a moment, as if letting the truth of that settle. Then, she nodded. They sat there for a long time, wrapped in the quiet of the evening, in the certainty of each other. And for the first time in a long time, Delilah wasn't afraid of holding on.